We were talking last time about the suffering that the believers in Baghdad were experiencing when Baha'u'llah was about to be exiled. And also the townspeople were lamenting. And so many people were coming to his house in grief that the governor offered him time on the island of the Garden of Rizwan before he was to be exiled. And so Baha'u'llah crossed the river in a boat with 3 of his sons and his amanuensis. And while he was crossing the river, the afternoon call to prayer happened at that moment to be sounded. And a number of spectators said that there was an exhilaration in the air, almost an exaltation in the atmosphere, and that it seemed fitting to be hearing this call that God is most great, Allahu Akbar, as Baha'u'llah was disembarking on the Garden of Rizwan. And he began to pace the avenues of roses in the garden and revealed the Rizwan tablet, which we'll go over in our next time. And this was the book that I had suggested that we look at, the series of tablets that Baha'u'llah revealed about the holy days. And we'll use this next time. But one of the tablets that Baha'u'llah revealed in the garden that we'll discuss now was his tablet to Job about the character in the Bible and the Quran. Sometimes this particular tablet is called the Surah of Patience. And most of us are familiar with the character of Job in the Bible and how he suffered. Well, first of all, he was incredibly successful. He had all kinds of wealth and lovely children. He was well respected. In fact, he was considered a prophet. He was very devoted as a believer in God, and was always leading people to the divine fragrances. And everyone began to say, well, not everyone, but as people sometimes do when someone is successful, to bring him down, they were saying that, well, he's only blessed and happy because he has all this material wealth and a happy family. So then all his children die, loses his wealth, loses his crops. He gets exiled from his homeland, and then terrible boils break out over his body. A plague not probably too dissimilar to how we're feeling right now with what's going on. Wondering, why is all this happening? And that becomes the theme of the book of Job in the Bible, that these friends come to visit, saying, look, you must have done something wrong. They're moralists. And so they're saying there's only 2 possibilities here. Suffering is caused by God, and God is just, so you must be guilty of something. And the only other argument is suffering is caused by God. Job is innocent. Therefore, God is unjust. And that's not tenable. And so, at that point, Joseph begins this divine dialogue with the Ancient of Days. And in many ways, that style is reminiscent to me of Baha'u'llah's fire tablet, in which Baha'u'llah is recounting his sufferings in Akka, in the most great prison. And it's heart-wrenching. And then the voice of the Ancient of Days responds. And the third act, so to speak, is Baha'u'llah's final response of resolution and resignation to the will of God. Now, it's not the same exactly in the book of Job in the Bible, but it's more appropriate to what we're experiencing right now with our questions about the suffering that the world is going through. And so I'm going to read one part of Job's lament to God, because I think sometimes people feel this way when they don't understand suffering. So Job says, now this is Stephen Mitchell's translation of the book of Job in the Old Testament. God does not care. So I say he murders both the pure and the wicked. When the plague brings sudden death, he laughs at the anguish of the innocent. He hands the earth to the wicked and blindfolds its judges' eyes. Who does it, if not he? So we all know that idea of raging against the sky, crying out about our suffering, why me? And it's a poem of moral outrage. It's the voice of accusation against God. And it's a catharsis for him to be able to do this. If not a resolution, this notion of, why me? But there might be a third possibility, that suffering comes from God, God is just, and Job is innocent. In other words, maybe it's not a rational reason why suffering happens. Certainly we don't know why innocent children suffer. I mean, that is one of the mysteries of the universe. We see this going on in the world. And we know that sometimes we hear the expression that God is love, but that's a bit limiting. And it's almost sentimental, because we know from the long healing prayer that God is also called the destroyer, the ravager, God of grace to the wicked. When my sister had cancer and I gave her the long healing prayer, that disturbed her, these names of God, the ravager, the destroyer. And yet we know that in other religions, the Hindu gods, Kali and Shiva, are the gods of destruction. Shiva even has a necklace of skulls around her neck. So God is love, but he's also disease and death and destruction. And we know from childhood that the universe is not fair, that the universe does not run on moral principles, that the good always get rewarded and the wicked punished. And so Job gets this response from the Ancient of Days. And as I say, this is not exactly what goes on in the fire tablet, but I think this divine dialogue is very fitting for what many of us are feeling, perhaps, and experiencing right now. Who is this whose ignorant words smear my design with darkness? Stand up now like a man. I will question you. Please instruct me. Where were you when I planned the earth? Tell me if you were so wise. Do you know who took its dimensions, measuring its length with a cord? What were its pillars built on? Who laid down the cornerstone? While the morning stars burst out singing, and the angels shouted for joy. Have you seen where the snow is stored, or visited the storehouse of hail? Where is the west wind released, and the east wind sent down to earth? Do you deck the ostrich with wings, with elegant plumes and feathers? Do you give the horse strength? Do you dare to deny my judgment? Am I wrong because you are right? Now in the book of Job, this voice comes out of a whirlwind. It's not an anthropomorphic concept of God, this voice. And clearly, the power of it is like the ocean or the wind. And my understanding, and of course I have Abdu'l-Baha's help to understand this, is that we don't see with the eye of God. We don't always have the full picture and understand why certain things happen. And Abdu'l-Baha gives that wonderful example about the death of a child. And he said, if you didn't understand gardening and you saw a gardener tearing up a young shoot, you'd say, oh my gosh, that's terrible. Why is that gardener killing that plant? But Abdu'l-Baha says, that part of the garden perhaps is too dark. And what the gardener is doing is he's uprooting that shoot, that young plant, to move it to a part of the garden that's more spacious and gets more light. And so in the same way, we don't have this overview with the eye of God. And what the book of Job, and I think what Baha'u'llah's tablet to Job then picks up on, it's exploding this notion that frankly some fundamentalists have, and many secularists that debunk religion, this notion that religion is for comfort. That it's some kind of a soothing excuse for why we suffer. And yet, I mean, the fact of the matter is that a spiritual seeker who's hungering for truth and justice is not satisfied with a menu, some moral code. Paradise, isn't a piece of cake that we get handed at a church picnic. It's really a joyous blood, sweat, and tears. In the sense that the way, why is that suffering joyous? Well, the same way that if you ask a mother, raising a child is joyous suffering, and nurturing our faith is like nurturing a child or a teen, and yet you wouldn't have it any other way. You would want to have that child despite the suffering. And so religion is not a walk in the park. It's a walk with the mystery. And that walk comes out of this third possibility, that suffering comes from God. God is just. Job is innocent. The rational mind can't grasp that with our limited vision. It's like a Zen koan, like the story of Abraham being asked to sacrifice his child. It's not something that can be encompassed by the rational mind. And so Job's response at the end of the biblical book of Job is like Baha'u'llah's resignation at the end of the fire tablet. I know you can do all things, and nothing you wish is impossible. I have spoken of the unspeakable and tried to grasp the infinite. Therefore, I will be quiet, comforted that I am dust. So the book of Job, to my understanding, is this story of spiritual transformation. That's not passive submission in the end of the book of Job to me. It's really an active embrace of resignation and patience with not understanding the full will of God. And so many of us have chanted, God is sufficient unto me, in him let the trusting trust. And when we get put to the test, it really makes us wonder how much we really are reliant upon God and do trust that he doeth whatsoever he willeth and will not be asked of his doings. So in the Garden of Rizwan, Baha'u'llah reveals this tablet of Job, sometimes, as I say, called the Surah of Patience. And it's about this mystery of suffering. It's not translated into English yet, so I have most of my knowledge from Adib Taherzadeh in his revelation of Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah wrote this book in honor of a devout and devoted Babi who had suffered with Vahid during those times of the martyrdoms of the Babis. He suffered terribly, was tortured, was imprisoned, and never lost his faith, never questioned the will of God. And Baha'u'llah is celebrating this steadfastness, this resignation, exemplified by this devout Babi. And Adib Taherzadeh, in his book, he goes on to elaborate how Baha'u'llah talks about the mystery of suffering and how oftentimes it's only through outside pressures that the potential of something is released. But more specifically to Baha'u'llah's tablet, Baha'u'llah urges the believers in Baghdad to have three kinds of patience. He urges them to have patience with themselves, in the sense of having these questions or doubts, and also having patience with our own animal nature, with its lusts and its desires. To be patient with ourselves because God is patient with us. Then the second kind of patience Baha'u'llah in this tablet of Job urges upon the believers is to be patient with their suffering. And trusting in God in that sense, even if we can't understand it. Praying that God's will be revealed to us. And then the third patience he enjoins upon the believers is to have patience with their fellow believers, no matter what. And we know that the Guardian has said in one of his letters that our greatest tests will be other Baha'is. So patience in those conditions is being enjoined upon us by Baha'u'llah, that we're resigned to God's will in the sense of an active embrace, not in a passive type of submission, but to actively accept the ordeal that we may go through sometimes. Now, this tablet had an incredible effect on the Babis, so we're told, because it was preparing them for the tests and trials that were to come, the ordeal of this separation from Baha'u'llah. And it gave them the courage to deal with this separation. And I think it's fitting then that we end today's examination of Rizwan with a quote from one of my favorite passages. It doesn't come from a Rizwan tablet. It comes from the tablet of the world. And I guess because of the sufferings in my life, it became a companion to me. And maybe that's why much of it I seem to remember by heart. Baha'u'llah says, and I think it's very appropriate for what the world is going through right now to hear these words. O my servants, sorrow not if in these days and on this earthly plane things contrary to your wishes have been ordained and manifested by God. For days of blissful joy, of heavenly delight, are assuredly in store for you. Worlds holy and spiritually glorious will be revealed to your eyes. You are destined by him, in this world and hereafter, to partake of their benefits, to share in their joys, and to obtain a sustaining portion of their grace. To each and every one of them, you will, no doubt, attain